Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
She didn't get out of her last marriage and go to a millionaire? There's a story today with a similar plot. Enjoy it! Linda Harris Donaldson McCullough was Sill's unexpected omnipresent queen. She held this title for 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days, minus a few hours or so. Whether she deserved it or not didn't matter. Being Daniel McCullough's wife gave her access to all the benefits and privileges of everything the city had to offer, which in hindsight was nothing more than smoke and memories. Of course, there were clubs and meetings with their places of honor and prestige, all of which mattered to those who valued any sense of social status. Of course, there was money. Daniel was richer than any other soul, not only in the city but in the whole county. It was family money, and it was almost as old as the house he grew up in. The McCulloughs were accustomed to winning and achieving success, and when it was not achieved through hard work, planning, or luck, it was achieved through deception and cunning. Linda was used to her good looks and nothing else, or so she thought until she came across Daniel McCullough's interest. She did not suffer from a lack of sustenance or material goods, but noble wealth was the grass on the other side of the fence, or in this case, a few stone walls and miles to the east. Until then, her home had been comfortable, with all the amenities of a respectable middle-class existence. That is until she did the tripping trick. "Jesus, girl, you could fall flat on your beautiful 5th place," Daniel McCullough told her after he caught her in his arms when she tripped. Linda looked into the face of the man who was holding her and thanked him profusely. "Seriously, you should be more careful here. It could have been a nasty fall." "I don't know what I was thinking, sir. I'm really sorry, but thank you so much for catching me the way you did." "That would be really bad," Linda smiled, looking into the man's smiling face. After composing herself, adjusting her tight skirt and high heels, Linda turned back to the imposing polished brass door as Daniel McCullough held the door open for the attractive woman entering his domain. He didn't know who she was, but he knew right away that he wanted her, even if it was just to enjoy the forbidden fruit under her too short skirt. The sparkling ring on her left hand was largely unremarkable in his mind, even if it was of paramount importance to some other man. The McCulloughs took what they wanted, and Daniel was well trained in their predatory ways. Once inside, the fox turned right, and the prey moved left towards a bank of elevators to continue on its way to the offices of Latson, McCullough, and Sperry. There was an advertisement in the morning paper for an administrative assistant position at a firm offering a modest salary and benefits for Monday through Friday work, which seemed a good fit for Linda's talents and ambitions. "Mrs. Donaldson, I am sure that we will come to a comfortable agreement on the details, and we will review all your documents later. But I am sure that for now, I would like to welcome you to the firm." The old man sealed these words with his handshake and wandering gaze as she sat in the chair opposite. Tom Latson could hardly restrain himself from drooling down his spotted chin. Linda's skirt rode up high, revealing an inappropriate expanse of smooth thighs. He may have been an old man well into his 70s, but his memory still excited him, even if his physical capabilities limited him in his current state. On the other hand, Daniel McCullough watched the negotiations between them with more than curiosity. There was something about this woman that aroused him more than intimate interest. Her beauty was intoxicating, and the manner in which she presented herself innocently increased the desire to possess her as his own. He looked longingly through the two-way glass mirror on the wall at the raven-haired beauty as she crossed her legs and smiled, the very rise of her breasts with every breath drawing his eyes to the beautiful sight. "Thank you, Mr. Latson. I'm so happy to work for you, and I'm sure I won't disappoint you." She stood up from her seat, and Latson led her into another room for the show. And Daniel stood there, rooted to the spot, intoxicated with lust and desire. Tom didn't hire her for himself. She was going to work for Dave Sperry, the other senior partner. Or at least, that was the plan. For the rest of the day, she reported directly to Daniel McCullough, the firm's managing senior partner. Mrs. Linda Donaldson was the 30-year-old stunningly beautiful wife for 10 years of a rather simple man with simple tastes, Liam Donaldson. She came from a humble family, and before these events had never shown any outward interest in privileged things. Liam was a middle manager for a small manufacturer on the outskirts of town with a salary and expectations of more when time and experience allowed. The house was pleasant, with plenty of space, a patio, and a pool added for frequent entertaining among their friends and neighbors. Linda and her husband had moved here from a larger city for a factory job a few years earlier, and Linda had left a decent position at a law firm for her husband's more lucrative job. However, boredom set in, and she decided she needed to get back to work for Daniel McCullough. Linda's boredom turned out to be an opportunity for both of them, and ultimately, at Liam's expense. Linda was that woman, and I was Liam, her ex-husband. I suppose, in some respects, I could be considered a simple man. This was certainly Mullock's unfounded opinion of me. And I guess it must have largely been Linda's, since she left me for that. In any case, I survived unharmed. Linda began working for McCullough the following Monday after her interview and had settled into her role quite well, judging by her demeanor. At first, it was a job from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., but after a few months, everything changed. She started working a couple of evenings during the week and returned home around 9 or 10 p.m. I spent enough time at the plant that I couldn't complain too much. Regardless of the work week, we were together every weekend, and life continued to be good, or at least it seemed so. About 6 months after she started working at the firm, I finally met her boss. I wasn't looking forward to it, but it was the annual Christmas party, and it was held on the Mulla family farm a couple of miles outside of town. It was an old house with an attached garage and barn, sitting on top of a hill overlooking rolling fields, woods, and meadows beyond. High, neat stone walls guarded the owner as you drove up the road to the entrance. Linda wore a dark blue dress with a mid-thigh slit, an open back, and a wide cleavage in the front. The heels highlighted her long legs, and her dark hair was pulled back into a tight French braid. The look was completed with a single strand of white pearls. I simply put on a white shirt with dark pants and polished cowboy boots, along with my usual smile. We argued about it a little before we left, but eventually, Linda just raised her hands, and we left. We were greeted at the door of the mansion by a polite young lady who led us into the living room along with several other guests, and we were greeted by the charming Mr. Daniel Mulla himself. Apparently, there was no Mrs. Mulla, something my wife had not mentioned for the past few months. "Linda, I'm so glad you came," he said, hugging my wife and kissing her on the lips. "You must be Linda's husband, Liam. I've heard so much about you," he told me, taking my hand in his and trying to assert his dominance. Our palms met, and when he squeezed his hand with unnecessary force, I returned the squeeze doubly, all the while assessing this stranger, not taking my eyes off him. He shouldn't have kissed my wife on the lips. I felt him involuntarily loosen his grip. "Yes, I'm Liam." "Nice to meet you," I lied, looking him straight in the eyes. He shouldn't have kissed my wife. McCullough led us and a few others through the house into a large hall where we socialized, chatted, and entertained each other with stories of our lives. Luckily, some of the guests were quite interesting, and I really enjoyed it, so much so that I lost track of my wife for a while. I looked around a couple of times and just assumed she had gone off with one of the other women, so I turned my attention back to the guys I was chatting with. After about an hour, Linda slid into my hand and returned to her role as an obedient wife next to her husband. I asked her where she went, and she just said, "Normal girl talk." We left soon after, and when we got home, she excused herself and took a quick shower before going to bed. This was the beginning of my decline as a respected husband, although, as in many cases, it was gradual until I was pushed into the abyss. Over the next few months, Linda became something of a stranger. Culminating in the blue-white heat of lightning striking the center of the kitchen table in the shape of a manila envelope. I knew we had been growing apart lately, but I ignored the ominous signs. Linda worked longer and longer hours, adding a Saturday for good measure. I was passed over for the position of general production manager because of the plant manager's favoritism. This was not entirely unexpected, but in Linda's opinion, it simply reinforced her perception of our existence as unworthy of her. A perception of which I was completely unaware. Maybe all the signs were there, and I was just too ignorant to see them. Perhaps the Christmas party and its convenient disappearance should have provided a glimpse of the disaster brewing just on my horizon. Looking back, I realized that I was just a happy blind idiot with a beautiful wife caught in the crosshairs of a depraved predator. She was not at home, everything was tidy, and nothing looked out of place. The only thing that greeted me was this damn envelope lying in the middle of the table. I looked at the letterhead and began to tense up. In the top left corner, it said Latson McCullough and Sperry, and below it was just my name. I carefully opened it and laid out the contents on the table. There's some truth to the concept of fearful immobility. I learned that the soul can remain motionless despite the fact that all the senses are excited for some response. The last item out of the envelope, and the one I almost missed among the papers, was the small diamond engagement ring I gave Linda over 10 years ago. It belonged to my mother, who died when I was 17, and my father gave it to me when I told him I was going to propose to Linda. It was a simple family heirloom but nonetheless precious to me. When I saw this, I didn't need to know anymore, but I read it anyway. It was a petition for divorce signed by her. Interestingly, she didn't ask for anything other than cash, which she had already taken. There were 3 sets of documents, one for me and the other 2 needed to be signed, notarized, and sent to court. I sat in a chair, looked at the documents, and felt nothing but emptiness and abyss. There were no tears, but there was a lot of rage. It was an easy decision for me. I stood up, grabbed the papers, a box of matches, and went out onto the patio. Every piece of paper went into the fire. I burned it all with rage. Linda! It won't end like this. I screamed inside my gutted shell. I didn't know where she was, her mobile phone did not answer, and her whole family was a couple of 100 miles away. It was 2 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. The polished brass door to Latson McCullough and Sperry swung open easily, and the click of cowboy boots and the vapor of several glasses of cognac floated after me as I stood at her empty desk. Where the hell is she? I didn't ask anyone in particular. A couple of office workers hurried away, perhaps in search of an alarm or a bomb shelter. She's not here, and if you were half as smart as the leather in your boots, you'd get the hell out of here. He stood and looked at me in his polished Brooks Brothers boots and $2,000 suit, Mr. Daniel Patrick Mulla himself. His haircut and slender figure only emphasized what a jerk he really was. What the hell do you mean when you say she's not here? She works here, doesn't she? When the corners of his mouth began to lift into Mole's grin, I recognized my nemesis. In the back of my mind, I remembered the missed hour of the Christmas party. And then all of her long evening hours away from home, working hard for her boss. Donaldson, you can leave now, or they will escort you out. Linda is in a safe place, and you no longer have the right to interfere in her affairs. I started to let my common sense get the better of me and started to turn towards the door. Then he made this sound. It was that nasty puckering sound of a kiss, loud enough for me to hear, a sound that made me sound like a weakling. When I turned, his smile turned into a smirk, and then he made the mistake of opening his mouth and speaking, almost in a whisper, "This tidbit is now mine. Get out of my office." Stupidity comes in different brands and flavors. His mouth was disgusting and dirty. My hand was hard and bloody when I got to him, his shirt was in my hand, and my other hand was beating the crap out of his eyes and nasty mouth. I saw blue and saliva along with teeth on the floor, but I wasn't done yet. The heel of my middle-class cowboy boot found his crotch, and whatever pleasure it gave my unfaithful wife would have to wait a while. But before I could completely destroy his manhood, my world plunged into darkness. Staring at the ceiling in a punishment cell is a favorite pastime of every soul who graces a prison establishment with their presence. The sickly color of its putrid pea-green walls and the bright lights hidden behind rusty wire mesh do nothing to suit the prisoner's condition. The loud, unpleasant clanging of the steel doors locking its occupants inside for another round of bad food and bad company is a constant throughout the day. The only lull in activity comes around 1 a.m. or so when newcomers to the Iron Resort are kept downstairs in the reception center until processing in the morning. I sat there for 2 days and 20 minutes, waiting first for a magistrate hearing and then for a couple of hours until my lawyer negotiated bail. It cost me $5,000, but finally, late Friday night, I walked out into the sunshine and a new world. Liam, look, I know this is embarrassing, but I want you to stay out of your way and stay out of any trouble. Do you hear me? Jake Reynolds told me this over beers that night. Jake was the guy who hired me 3 years ago and has been my mentor since day one, and I have nothing but the deepest respect for the old man. He looked out from under his deep-set eyes and bushy eyebrows, sipping the double whiskey that was always placed in front of him. That McCulloch will kill you if you're not careful, young man. He and his ilk pretty much own everyone and everything in the city, including the damn judge. I talked to the old man about it, and he agreed to keep me on board no matter what. Apparently, there is some animosity between him and Mullah that goes back to when he built this plant 10 years ago. I don't know the whole story, but there's damn sure no love connection between them. I thank the old man immensely for staying with me. More than likely, I was facing some serious jail time before it was over, but my lawyer thought I could get away with a year in county jail and a couple of years of probation if I was lucky. If this were not so, I could have received 5 years in a medium security correctional facility. Keeping my nose clean was crucial. I bought another portion for each of us, and we parted for the night. I did something with Daniel McCullough, and it took him a while to come around, judging by the neighbors' stories. The man had a broken cheekbone, several front teeth knocked out, and his eyes remained blackened for a long time. The main problem for him was that I broke one of his nuts, and the other one was unreliable. I have no idea how people get this information, but at least it was nice to think that I had achieved something for all the trouble he got me into. As for Linda, I had a restraining order preventing me from doing almost anything to do with her or Mullah. I learned that she lived on the Mullah farm and apparently still worked in a law office. Restraining orders have been a problem in a city like ours, this small town. I couldn't be within 500 feet of her, that idiot, or their offices. This meant I couldn't even drive down Main Street or eat at the 3 restaurants located in the heart of the city. Technically, simply going to court would violate the order. That first weekend back from prison was a difficult time. Being an idiot for not seeing it coming to me didn't help me at all, and getting over the loss of the woman I loved like no one else for 10 years. During those 2 days, I shed a lot of tears alone and drank a lot of booze. But on Monday morning, I returned to work, and I must say that I was pleasantly surprised by the reception I received. Everyone seemed to be quite delighted with my reaction when some idiot stole my wife. Even a few of the women at the factory stopped by to see how I was doing. I didn't mean to act in the wounded emotional state I was in, but it was comforting and a boost to my male ego. My trial was scheduled in 3 weeks, and the time really flew by. I avoided trouble by no longer seeing both adulterers, and my lawyer and I went to court on a cool Monday morning. Several of my colleagues were in the room, and McCullough and Linda were sitting behind the district attorney. McCullough just stared at me, while Linda stared almost catatonic, lifelessly at her hands. My lawyer met with the prosecutor last week, and they reached a plea agreement that I didn't expect but was better than the alternative, 5 years. I would turn myself into the county jail to serve a 1-year sentence suspended for 4 years on good behavior. I also had to pay Mullah $22,000 in compensation for medical expenses. He was a millionaire, so it was all bullshit, but of course, I agreed. The only catch was that the judge added 1 extra day to my sentence. It didn't sound like much, but my lawyer objected, and it was quickly overruled. This meant that I had to serve the entire 12 months and 1 day in jail without parole. Otherwise, I could be released on good behavior after serving 244 days. Linda didn't look at me, but I saw tears on her cheeks. No explanation, no words that she was sorry, nothing but her damn tears. Well, that's all I remember about that feeling. Jake told me he would look after the house while I served my sentence. The house was already paid for, and I had enough saved to take care of taxes, insurance, and anything else that came up. I gave in the following Monday morning and began my time with pea soup green walls in the company of 28 other baddies watched over by 6 prison guards. There were 2 other prisoners with me in a shared cell for 6 people, so we had enough space to spread out. One of the guys was sentenced to 30 days for drunk driving, and the other was serving 60 days for possession of marijuana. I think the worst offender in this place was me. 3 months into my stay, I received a divorce decree. I could have fought it, but my lawyer and I decided it would be a waste of time while I was in jail. The only good thing about all of this was that Linda still only had the cash she had taken the day she left the papers on the kitchen table. I still had my house, my savings, and everything else we had accumulated in our 10 years of marriage. I had visitors 3 or 4 times a week, mostly people from the plant, and a couple of my neighbors came by a few times. It broke the monotony and helped make the stay bearable, and it also reinforced the knowledge that I had friends who cared about halfway through my stay. I was reading the newspaper and discovered that Linda and this idiot had gotten married in a ceremony and reception at McCullough Farm, with half the town in attendance. There was a large photograph of the bride and groom. She was wearing a flowing white wedding dress with a train that was at least 15 feet long. Mullah must have gotten some new teeth because he was smiling. The worst happened later, and I realized how much influence Mullah had on people with power and influence. It was around 11:30 p.m. on Saturday night, just after the night crew had gone on duty. Prison wardens were mostly appointed by county commissioners, most of whom were in Daniel Mullah's pocket. I heard screams and yells in the common area and got up from my bunk to see what was going on. Several prisoners were gathered around a large wall-mounted television in the corner, engrossed in watching a movie. It was an intimate, explicit video, and as graphic as it gets. The boys became increasingly rowdy as the video became increasingly lewd. He turned to the camera, which was probably on a dresser or something, and said the words I had already heard, "This tidbit is now mine." Daniel McCullough just grinned and turned back to my ex-wife. The prisoners continued to shout and encourage the couple, and I returned to my bunk. My 2 roommates had long since been released, and I was left to my own devices. It was good because it was a rough night. For the first time in months, I had tears in my eyes and troubled sleep. The taunts of a couple of jailers the next morning nearly pushed me over the edge, but somehow I let it go and focused on my life. I had 4 months left, and then I would go out into the sunlight again with a clean nose. One thing the video made clear to me was that my cheating wife didn't leave me for bed thrills. Daniel McCullough didn't offer much to make women gasp, at least from what I could see. What Linda Harris Donaldson McCullough acquired was wealth, and it was apparently worth more than 10 years with a devoted husband. Punisher was all I remember thinking about for the last 4 months I was there, and not a single thought about it was intimate. The county let me go with my old clothes and the smile of the girl behind the counter. Her husband worked with me at the plant. My lawyer met me in the lobby, and we went to lunch, a double cheeseburger and 2 pints of beer. Now that the restraining order was lifted because the divorce was final, and I was free to come and go as and where I pleased. The remainder of my sentence in excess of 1 year and 1 day was suspended, which meant I did not have to report to a police officer or report to the court. I was completely free. Liam, I'm just telling you this so you know and don't misunderstand, Jake told me later that evening over a beer. That arrogant idiot threw a couple of punches at your ex-wife a couple of weeks ago and then claimed she fell from the stairs. She agreed with this story, but no one believes it. Well, her grass is definitely greener on the other side of the fence, isn't it? I told him. He just looked at me strangely. Well, son, I know you don't like her now, but when I heard about it, I just tried to remember the girl I met when you 2 first came to town. I wouldn't wish that vile on anyone as a husband. Jake was right, of course. I hate that woman for what she did, but I loved her for a long time. It's damn hard to go through life like this. My parents went through something similar when I was little. My mom had an affair, and they broke up for a while because of it. After my mom died, we had a long conversation about life and expectations. Dad told me he hated her for what she did, but he still loved her. The only way to get through all of this, from his point of view, was to either find another woman to love or find a way to live with the woman he already loved. It devastated my mother as much as it devastated my father, but in the end, they found a way to create real peace in their lives. He had to choose one or the other. He couldn't just languish like that. I decided to find peace with a good new woman. Sherry has been flirting with me ever since I returned to my old job. Jake was true to his word. He kept my position open until I was able to get back into it, and I was forever grateful. Sherry was a couple of years younger than me and managed the logistics team at the plant. We had the same work schedule, so we often bumped into each other, and one Friday afternoon, I decided to ask her out. That evening, I picked her up early, and we went to dinner at a new steakhouse out of town. She was dressed to impress, and to be honest, I was as nervous as a schoolboy on his first date with a girl. I hadn't been with any woman other than Linda for the last 11 years, and I certainly hadn't been intimate with anyone in the last 12 months. Sherry didn't make it any easier with the killer cleavage she was showing off and her obvious femininity. I was smitten, and if she had any idea how bad it was, she could have manipulated me the way she wanted. We enjoyed dinner and a couple of drinks before heading to one of the 2 dance salons in town. There was a country bank man with big cowboy hats and a good repertoire of songs. This girl was dancing with me, and if I had let her, she would have had a night with me right there at the table. I was damn grateful she didn't because I had a blast. Later that night, Sherry and I dated over the next few months, and many people began to see us as a couple. After about 6 months, she agreed to move in with me. At first, it was a little strange having another woman living in the house with me compared to Linda. Sherry was almost the exact opposite physically. She was quite petite, vivacious, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and very outgoing. She loved to cook, and as a local native, she adored everything about Centerville and the community. She was involved in almost everything that happened in the community, which led to some uncomfortable situations for me. Once Linda Harris Donaldson McCullough became the wife, she easily entered all the social gatherings and clubs in the area. When she was just my mundane and boring middle-class wife, she never showed any interest in local events. Now she was everywhere and unavoidable, including at the same social events as Sherry. I should have avoided commitment when asked, but I didn't think about it at the time. The moment Sherry told me, "You need to rent a tuxedo," she said, "Why?" "Because we're going to the ball at Cville Garden, and you'll wear black tie, that's why." How could I argue with that? So, I did. I tried on a black tie tuxedo and bought Sherry a fantastic dress for the occasion, and we went to the ball a couple of weeks later. It was one of those exclusive events open to the public if you bought expensive tickets to the fundraiser and could afford black tie and an evening gown. Since Sherry had been a long-time member of the club, she was expected to attend with her gentleman escort. There were a lot of famous people in town, and on my way back from the restroom, I ran into one of them. She paid no attention, smiling at the nonsense her companion was spouting, and ran straight into me. Our eyes met, and I caught both fear and remorse before they darted away and then returned. "Linda," I simply stated, without much emotion. It was the first word I'd spoken to her since the night I found the papers on the kitchen table. In fact, it was the first time I had seen her since I stood in the courtroom to receive my sentence for beating up the arrogant who stole her from me. She struggled to find the words she needed to say and could only whisper, "Liam." As I left, I heard her say this in a barely audible whisper, "I am sorry." I think I stopped for a moment, but I know I continued down the hallway and returned to the ballroom. Sherry was deep in conversation with 3 men and waved at me as I stood at the bar to refresh my drink. If there was one thing I knew, it was that I would never have to worry about seeing her get taken away by another man. She was burned in her first marriage by her dissolute husband and did not hide what she thought about my ex-wife. He tried to destroy her financially and almost succeeded until one of the husbands of the women he was running around with gave him a convincing argument to just leave town and not look back. He followed the advice and left everything to Sherry, and nothing has been heard from him since. When I returned to her, she introduced me to her companions, who turned out to be old friends of her family, one of whom led her to the dance floor, leaving me to entertain my new acquaintances. She at least winked when she did it. Later on the dance floor, she whispered in my ear, "Do you mind seeing her here tonight?" I knew what she was talking about. In the past, we talked at length about each other's difficulties. Her life was a closed book, mine was still an open tragedy that never ended. "I am fine." I ran into her in the hallway, but we didn't talk. I think she wanted to, but she couldn't, and I didn't want to hear anything she had to say, I said. We danced in silence for a while, and then she hugged me tightly. Returning to the table was a different matter. We ended up walking past Mr. and Mrs. Mulla, and the arrogant idiot tried to make that puckered sucking sound, but the block of ice, or maybe the false teeth I had given him, got in the way. However, I turned around, and at that moment, I heard Sherry say, "For years, Liam. It's not worth 4 years." She was right. I turned to my companion, but not before seeing the shame on Linda's face. Sherry and I didn't have intim that night. Instead, we made love for most of the rest of the night, and I think it was around 3 a.m. before we finally fell asleep. I've always wanted to see the sunrise sky through my bedroom window, and around 8 a.m. Sherry pulled back the curtains, and the bright sunshine of a clear Sunday morning flooded the bedroom. She stood there without clothes and beautiful before sitting down on the edge of the bed. "I want to leave the house today and ride into the mountains, but first, I have to tell you something," she said. The first thing that came to my mind was that she was going to have a baby. "I love you, Liam. I want you to know that I love you." I wanted to say it on the dance floor last night, and I wanted to say it last night when we made love, but I didn't. So, I'm saying it now, she said. I just pulled her to me, hugged her, kissed her tenderly, and said, Sherry, I love you. And I was afraid it wasn't mutual, but now I know it's not. We ate a quick breakfast and packed our basket to head out onto the boulevard before heading out on our day's adventure. We had our picnic in a small meadow overlooking the expansive green valley and enjoyed each other's company for a couple of hours. Liam, do you think you two will ever properly consummate your marriage? She asked decisively. We did it, she continued, closing the case with the finality of divorce, and she left me with almost everything we had in favor of running away with the gilded son of A. There was a little anger in my voice that told us both that there was never really an end to this. I needed it, and we both knew it, but I didn't know how to do it. The next few months passed, and life on the home front continued in a nice, smooth direction. Sherry and I had a great relationship, and work was going well. Jake recommended me for a promotion, and the odds looked pretty good. The only downside to all of this was that every time I turned around, it was Mr. and Mrs. McCullough. They were interested in everything, and every time Sherry and I attended an event, I had to endure Daniel McCullough's ridicule and what eventually turned into indifference on Linda's part. I think the indifference was a cover for her own guilt, but by then, we had divorced a couple of years ago, and I had moved on to a new woman and what I felt was a better life. However, the old burn was still there, so we didn't finish it properly. Then everything changed. Sherry and I were driving back from a charity event one evening when blue lights appeared in my rearview mirror. Please get out of the car, the deputy said. I did as he asked and stood at the back door of my truck as he walked around to the passenger side of the vehicle and asked Sherry for ID, which she provided. The other officer just stood there and watched me. I couldn't see what he was doing, but when he turned to his partner, he spoke, Yes indeed, there is one beautiful piece here which is right in our hands. I think we should taste it. I rushed to the deputy sheriff, but he held me back and pulled out his weapon. At that moment, I froze and realized that in order to defuse this situation, reason and common sense would be required. You're going to have to kill us in cold blood if you think you're going to continue, and I don't think you're going to do that, I told the deputy holding me down. He simply laughed and waved to his partner standing near the back of the truck. Do you know how fast you were going? This was 30 miles per hour more than expected. Just stay here for a while until we write your ticket. When the idiot returned, he handed me a speeding ticket and said quietly, Mr. McCullough says hi to you, and next time you're running around this county, I might just have a little fun. You understand? I just took the fine and went back to the car. When I sat down, Sherry was crying and shaking from the experience. Come to me, I said, and she moved towards me. Did this son of a even touch you with a finger? I asked. He touched my chest, but that was all, she replied. At that moment, I was seething with anger. I started the truck and drove away from the scene. Later that evening, I sat down with Sherry and told her straight up that I was not going to put up with this, even if I got another sentence. Liam, listen to me. I'm a big girl, and I know how to take care of myself. I don't want you to go to jail for doing something this time. Please don't do anything stupid. We both know who's behind this, and we'll find a way to deal with it. Jake sat me down after work on Monday and explained everything. Young man, there are a lot of people here who don't like the sons of, and I guarantee you that little deputy and his partner will pay for what they did. Until then, you do your job, keep your nose clean, and keep loving that little girl, you hear? I followed his advice and kept my nose clean. A couple of weeks later, as I was leaving the pub after work, a county sheriff's deputy rushed by, followed by another patrol car and a rushing EMS unit. The next morning at work, I found out what had happened. The two peace officers were wrapped in burlap and taken to a gravel pit, where they were urged, in no uncertain terms, to resign from their posts and leave the county immediately. They seemed to have a new respect for a lady named Sherry, who was very popular with several of the large, friendly men from the plant. Their departure would have to wait until they were discharged from the hospital. Once again, life continued as before until the hounds of hell appeared in the form of Daniel McCullough. He and Linda went into the pub while Sherry, Jake, and I, along with a few other factory employees, enjoyed a few pints of beer after work as usual. They were dressed as if they were heading to an event at a country club rather than stopping at a pub for a beer. Linda often went with me to this very place when we were married, but I never saw McCullough or Latson. The door had been darkened at least once before. They took a table to the side of where we were sitting, and they were joined by the county sheriff in plain clothes and another couple I had never seen before. I continued, trying to focus on what was happening at this table. There are a few errors throughout the passage. There's nothing there but stinking crap. Sherry simply took my hand, and we went back to our banter and discussion. A few minutes later, McCulloch stood up and went to the restroom with 2 other men. Whether it was an accident or a coincidence, a moment later Linda was standing on the edge of our booth. "Liam, can we talk for a few minutes soon? When are you able?" I looked at her and simply asked, "For what?" This earned me a strong kick to the ribs from my better half. "Because the time has come, I should try to make things right if we can. I know you hate me, but I want to see this through to some end." About this time Mullah and the other men returned from the restroom, and an angry Mullah came to our table. He grabbed Linda's hand forcefully and pulled her away from the table. I started to get up, but Jake stopped me. "She's his wife, not yours, Liam." Linda stood behind her husband, cowed, looking at the floor. The man spoke to me. "If I catch you talking to her or just seeing you next to her, I will gut you like a pig. Do you understand me, boy?" I looked up at him and said, "Go to hell." Maybe it was the confidence of impunity from having his friend the sheriff in close proximity, or maybe it was his sense of invincibility. Whatever it was, my comment prompted him to take his best shot. While I was sitting there in the booth, he threw a girlish punch that grazed my cheek. Rushing forward, I grabbed him by the head and hit my face on the edge of the table. He fell backward and sprawled prone on the carpet. The sheriff grabbed me by the shoulder, trying to arrest me for assault, but one of the guys at the other end of the booth held up a camera and let him know that the whole thing was on video. Mullah apparently made the first lunge and provoked the collision. The 2 men helped the emasculated to his feet and led him out the door, followed by a completely upset Linda. "Jesus Christ, it was incredible," Jake exclaimed and raised his beer. No better thing could have happened to this idiot. Linda should have warned him. I've been boxing most of my life, ever since my dad threw a pair of boxing gloves at my brother and me and started teaching us how to box and defend ourselves when I was 12 years old. With witnesses who could confirm the true events, I felt pretty good. I felt fine until about 3 o'clock the next day, an excited Sherry told me. One of the girls told me that Linda was admitted to the hospital this morning. She was pretty badly beaten. Her husband told emergency workers that she fell down the stairs because she was drunk. I knew this was. Linda no doubt drank alcohol, but only in moderation. I never saw her drink more than 2 drinks, even when we were dating and partying. She was only a fan of drinking a little socially. How badly is she injured, Liam? She's in intensive care at Lane Memorial Hospital. I didn't say anything to Sherry, but there was no need to. She knew that I would go to her whatever the circumstances. "Be careful," she told me. I pulled into the lot, parked my truck, entered the reception area, and walked down the hallway. I knew half the nurses in this establishment. It's a small town, and the girl on duty at the time had a brother who worked for me. She and her husband came to my place for a barbecue a couple of times. "Annie, what room is she in?" "I'll be careful, I promise." She didn't hesitate at all. "Room 1202, just around the corner." "Please, slowly, okay? And you can't stay for more than a couple of minutes." I thanked her, went around the corner, and looked into the room. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Her head was bandaged, and her mouth and nose were swollen. Her right arm was in a cast, as was her left ankle. Her chest also appeared to be bandaged. She didn't sleep. I took her small hand in mine and tried to smile at the woman who had once been my wife. I didn't love her as much as I used to, but I still loved her to some extent, even if I hated the hell out of her. Coincidentally, by my count, it's been 3 years, 3 months. And 3 days since she let that idiot put a ring on her finger. I looked at it in my hand, leaned over, and asked her, "He did this to you?" I didn't need any other words. I knew that getting drunk and falling anywhere was simply not going to happen to this woman. She looked into my eyes and nodded affirmatively. He's not going to do it again, ever. I kissed her hand and left the room. The crackling groan of a house fire is an unforgettable sound. Burwood Falls, further fueling the leaping flames. Firefighters may rush to a fire to pump tanker trucks of water onto the blaze, but living in the countryside comes with some costs. There are no fire hydrants to tap into, and 500 gallons of water or even 2 or 3 times that amount is no match for a fire monster with a 30-minute head start. The house was completely engulfed in flames, and orange-hot streaks of fire were already breaking through the roof when the first drop sprayed from the hose. All that firefighters could do was to contain the fire in the house and attached buildings. Other nearby buildings could only be doused with water to prevent them from catching fire from the intense heat and sparks. Sitting in the shade among the trees at the top of the hill, I watched the fire consume every remnant of what had once been the heart and soul of Daniel Patrick McCullough, his precious farm. His cars, his precious works of art, his 150 years of privileged history, all consumed by a hot and fiery vengeance, and all this because of someone else's wife. Smoke was still billowing from the charred wreckage as the morning light fell upon the fields, but I had long since moved on from the tragic scene. Sherry rolled over and pressed herself against me, urging me to wake up. I opened my eyes and saw her looking at me with a thoughtful expression on her face. Time to wake up, sleepyhead. We promised my parents that we would have a barbecue with them this afternoon, and we have a lot to prepare this morning. I think Mom said she was expecting about 50 people this time. I haven't forgotten, but I'm a little tired. Jake and those drunks shouldn't have kept you up this late, baby. Of course, she was right, and who was I to argue with the woman I loved? We arrived at her parents' house to help with the preparations, and by 1 p.m., people started arriving. The story on everyone's lips was about the fire the night before and how no one could find the owner of the house. I absorbed it all, every bite. It appears that Daniel Patrick McCullough has not been seen since the emergency personnel left the house to take Linda to the hospital. The rumor mill was in full swing. Some have speculated, for good reasons, that Mullah started the fire and escaped. Several more people came to realize that the old house was, in fact, a fire trap, and they were not at all surprised that it caught fire. Most had their own opinions one way or another, but no one had heard anything about the whereabouts of the owner. The barbecue ended in the early evening, and Sherry and I met up with Jake and his wife, along with a couple of other friends, at our usual watering hole. I heard from the guys from the fire department that they found Daniel McCullough in the basement of the burned house. It looks like he hanged himself, Jake said in a muffled voice. We exchanged glances for a moment, and shock showed on our faces. But if there was one grieving soul at the table for this pathetic from hell, it was well hidden. So, how did the fire start? Jake's wife asked. I don't know. They think it may have been old wiring, but the fire was so intense they may never know for sure, the guys said. The fire inspector would be checking on the situation over the next few days, but they didn't think there was any foul play involved, like arson or murder. God forbid. No, it looks like this smarmy jerk took his own life, beating his woman, and his damn house burned down right above him. Jake broke out into a smile at his last comment, and we all raised our mugs in a toast. The fire marshal completed his investigation and determined that the original fire was caused by poor wiring, possibly caused by a lightning strike. The sheriff's department determined that Mullah's death was a suicide. Although I was questioned twice about my whereabouts on the night in question, there was no doubt about my alibi. It was rock solid with Jake and 6 other witnesses to back it up. A couple of weeks after the fire at Latson Mullah's property, things started to get interesting. Federal investigators and bank auditors showed up and began investigating and auditing the firm's finances and investments. Although nothing criminal came of it, 2 months later, the company asked the federal bankruptcy court to reorganize. Instead, they faced liquidation when the feds slapped them with a couple of hefty fines for multiple violations. All this activity had little impact on Daniel Mullah's estate. Linda was discharged from the hospital 2 weeks after her admission and moved into a guest cottage on the farm while she attended to her late husband's affairs. Surprisingly, he did not have a will, and he also had no other family other than Linda as his widow. Essentially, she would receive everything after the government received its share. One of his ex-wives tried to do something about it, but their divorce agreement put an end to that pretty quickly. Her reign as the omnipresent queen of Setterville seemed to come to an end the day her husband decided to unleash his irrational wrath on her. However, for someone who was looking for the green grass of a better life, she had at least gained something by tolerating his beatings. All his wealth, acquired by dishonest or legal means, now belonged to her. I finally sat down with Linda Harris Donaldson McCulloch to end what I never had. She knew some things but had no idea about many things. She never knew about the video that was played in the prison or about his toxic boasts in his office building that long ago day. Her face paled a little when I told her how much pleasure that video gave to the dregs of society in prison. But in the end, it didn't really matter. Liam, I know it won't change anything, but if I had to start all over again, I would never do it. I was ashamed of leaving you, and as soon as I did, I really regretted it. I was captured by the wealth and brilliance of a famous person and discovered that to this person, I was nothing. He wasn't the least bit like you. What I did learn was that I was just another one of his acquisitions. Somehow, because I was your wife, he decided to target you as some sort of enemy while he seduced me. You know, it was stupid. All this wealth, there's no happiness in any of this. He was the most pathetic son of a I ever knew. Once I really got to know him, he started beating me while you were in jail and didn't stop until he put me in the hospital the night he, committed suicide. At the moment of uttering the last words, she looked at me, slightly raising her eyebrow above one eye. I wasn't going to pretend that I understood what she was talking about. Now, the big question is why, isn't it? There's no good reason, Liam. It wasn't you or what you did or didn't do. This was certainly not about his manhood. God, what a fool I am. I left a wonderful man. Yes, Liam, you are a beautiful, smart, and caring man, and Sherry is damn lucky to have you. I gave it all up for what I thought was a wonderful life, better than the one I had, and now I have to live with it. Have you ever loved me, Linda? She sat for some time, lost in her thoughts. You know, I asked myself this question 1,000,000 times. But I did it out of guilt and betrayal. And if I could convince myself that I didn't do it, I could then excuse what I did under the guise of something heroic or something like that. I never stopped loving you, Liam, even when I was in bed with the man I called my husband for 3 years. When you marry Sherry, I'll still love you. But I also know what I did to you, and there's no going back, right? I shook my head. She looked worse than when I was married to her. She was no doubt still a beautiful woman, more beautiful than any other woman in the city, but there was a new edge to her from the beatings and the guilt. She was a different woman, and she certainly knew that I was a different man than the one who sat at that table in my kitchen and read her petition for divorce. I actually hugged her one last time and also kissed her passionately one last time. I hated her to bits, but I still loved her. I played with the small box in my pocket, nervous as a church mouse looking out for the pastor's cat. Sherry looked beautiful as always. I asked her to dress up tonight because I wanted to take a walk around the city. We went to dinner at our favorite steakhouse on the outskirts of town, where we had our first date almost 4 years ago. Jesus, Liam, if you don't ask me soon, I'm going to have to go to the restroom, we both burst out laughing. And I fell to my knees in front of all the other customers and asked the woman I loved to marry me. When she said yes, I put my mother's ring on her finger and kissed her with a long kiss to the applause of all the restaurant patrons. Linda actually attended my wedding, invited by Sherry, but she missed the reception, and soon after that, she left the city forever. She came to town as the beautiful wife of a mid-level manager at a small manufacturing plant and left town as the wealthy widow of another man who never realized the cost of his theft. About a year after she left, someone deposited a cool $1 million into my bank account with just a short note in the text box, "Thank you for saving my life." I'm not one to complain about money. As for Daniel Patrick McCulloch, he is just a memory and a note in the chronicles of the City Historical Society. Someone wrote a long obituary for him, describing all his countless achievements, but in the end, it all turned out to be rubbish. He died at the end of a short rope with all his precious belongings about to burn in the fire around him. What do you think of our story today? It seems to me that the wife did something completely wrong by going into another marriage without dealing with the problems of her previous marriage. What's your opinion? Write in the comments. Until new video.